Okay, I want to talk about incentives and emerging properties in blockchain system today. And I think that this is a very, very central topic, which has been little touched so far. And I believe that this community of industry and of people that are making blockchain nowadays should consider this as one of the main part in their design of present and new blockchain systems. And in particular, let me say a little bit about emerging properties, because it's not exactly a common language term. And I mean, the example that I typically give is the following. Well, living beings ourselves are made of atoms, molecules, cells, organs, and the interaction among them. And, you know, we have quite a good understanding of how these things work, not perfect, but pretty good, actually. And if we put all our understanding together and list it down and we look at it carefully, what we completely miss is that we are alive. And in fact, that being alive is an emerging property. It's very obvious to anyone, the difference between something alive and something not alive. But it is emerging to the extent that actually we are not able to replicate it, even if we know everything. Some small organisms, we literally know everything about them, except why they are alive. And, well, blockchains are a little bit easier than living organisms, but not that easier, because they have to do anyway with living organisms, humans. And therefore, I mean, understanding the emerging properties of this system is really crucial and can be the difference between being alive or dead. Okay, let's start from the starting point, at least one starting point, which is the paper of Satoshi Nakamoto, 2009, and he designed this anonymous cash system which rely on majority, on consensus by majority, and the system is anonymous. And in her writing, the idea is that there is a community that validates transaction and agree on the content, and then eventually put in the block, and the block is hash sealed, etc., etc. And an important point is that the operation on verification and hashing and closing the block is remunerated. And actually, Satoshi herself say, look, this is one CPU, one vote, in analogy with one person, one vote of the 20th century. So we have some element that I put in red over there, and so the idea that consensus should be done by majority, that is a design constraint. It's something that Satoshi decided when decided to do this system. Also, the fact that users should be anonymous, this is again a design constraint. I mean, you want to have an anonymous system because you want to replicate cash, which is essentially anonymous. Then the community, the reference community, again is something related to the input into the system, and again, it is a constraint. You know, in this particular case of Bitcoin, it was addressing a wide community, anyone, essentially. And the fact that there is a specific hashing mechanism to do that, that is definitely a design technology system. And to some extent, is relatively marginal to the rest, to the whole system. And then remuneration. The remunerator again is defined by design, and that is what we call incentives, okay? People are remunerated to do that because that is a service very important for the security of the system. Well, today I will talk about this last point mainly, but at the end I will also wrap up with the rest. So one CPU, one vote. Well, we all know, I think, how the story went. People started, indeed, I mean, the idea of Satoshi was literally, if you read the paper, it's very obvious that, you stay there with your little PC and, while you do the transaction, you also do some service to the others, and eventually you make a little money out of it. Then when people realized that actually the money were not that little, they start using GPUs. GPUs goes about 5 times faster than CPUs and consume about a fourth of them, so it's much more convenient. Very soon they passed to FGPA, which is field programmable gate arrays. They are essentially solid-state programmable machines. That goes about 100 times faster than CPU and use about 20 times less electricity. And very soon, all this happened in 2012, by the way. Very soon, people start building ASIC, application-specific integrated circuit. This is in itself is an emerging phenomenon of Bitcoin. We should consider that at that time, I mean, people like Cisco and IBM, etc., when they were deciding to build an ASIC technology machine, they were setting up a team of, 10 engineers, a budget of between 1 to 100 million, setting a time frame of 5 to 10 years, and design it very, very carefully, and then getting this fantastic, super fast machine. Of course, those machines were doing a little bit more typically than hashing, but still, this happened during 1 year by who knows who, and in a completely spontaneous way. And this is the kind of mechanism that emerge and that are unexpected. Certainly, I mean, GPUs might have been conceivable at the time where Satoshi was writing his paper, but certainly not the use of ASIC. And of course, the paradigm shifted completely from one CPU, from a single user, to something completely different. And so what this incentive for mining created, they created a specialized activity. Users are not any longer equal. There is no longer one person, one CPU, one vote. There is a class of people that do only mining and don't do anything else. And we know that this is highly concentrated in the hand of 3, 4 major mining companies, groups, and mostly based in China. Well, we should remember that this is very typical of technology. I mean, if we look at what, if the people old enough to remember what was internet at the beginning was a very open place where you could do everything. People, the e-commerce bubble, everybody was believing that any small business would have been able to sell his stuff directly through his own page over the internet. And nowadays we have a few very large retailers that do this business for us very efficiently. Why? Because technology costs a lot of money, so it needs investment, and there is a scale economy that if you are larger, at the end, your cost is lower, and people are very happy to use your services. This is what happened to Bitcoin as much it happened to others. This is a consequence of the design. An emerging consequence of design. By the way, well, I think that everybody knows here, but at the moment, actually this was 3 weeks ago, so probably it's a bit different, but at the moment we are generating 30 ETA hashes per second. This is 30 to 10 to the 18th. It's a large number. Actually, the fastest supercomputer has more or less this flop velocity, so it's really impressive. It's 30 billions hashes per second, and this is done for this, what is called the proof of work, so the one CPU, one vote idea. And let me remark just a little bit, because that is important for the following things that I want to say, is that the proof of work should cost, and proof of work should cost a fraction of the value that is transacted, and this fraction cannot be infinitesimal. So what 38 hash are? Well, we are talking about 1 gigajoule. Well, we are talking about a consumption of around 1 joule for 4 giga hash. So we are talking about 30 gigawatts of electricity consumption. This is the way the machines work, which is a power plant similar to the one I picture, that is 1 gigawatt power plant. And at this moment, in these months, Bitcoin is more or less consuming about between 0.5 to 5 barrel of oil per second, which is a lot, but actually is not that much. Is a cost of about 0.5% of the money transferred through the network. 0.5 is exaggeratedly high if you compare with other services that bank offer that cost essentially nothing or fixed fees. However, if you are a Chinese that want to launder money out from the country, then 0.5% is a very, very, very low cost. It costs about 30% doing it on the black market. Let me remark a little bit the fact that proof of work should cost. And I mean, and don't go through this slide. There is a paper out, but I mean, the paper has a small note out. But it's very simple. I mean, it's to prevent double spending, and this is the concept of a basic security concept. You know, if you have a safe, the cost to break the safe should be similar to the value that is inside the safe. So the safe is safe if the cost to break it is similar to the value inside. Of course, I mean, there are always ways around it, but that's a very basic principle of security. And in this case, for the proof of work, it's exactly the same. So at the present, one block contains about 20 million US dollar, and people wait an average of 10 blocks, let's say, to get sure that things are into the blockchain, which means that you have to spend around 2 million per block if you want to be sure, because replicated 10 blocks will cost you 20 million, which is exactly the value inside. So you cannot steal more than 20 million, and to steal 20 million, it costs you 20 million. That's the full security. That will imply 10% cost to the proof of work. Instead, actually, it's much cheaper. It's about 1.5%. So what we have is that another emerging properties. The community decided actually 10% is probably not worth it. It will be probably is too high cost for a little, to some extent, security risk. And the economy ended up in a state, in equilibrium, which is about 0.5%. This means that the system is vulnerable, but this also means that the system is cheaper. I mean, this is similar to, I don't know, Visa. Clearly, security on credit card is very, very low. I mean, numbers goes around, and everybody you pay with, especially with the paper one, has your number. Nonetheless, I mean, the security cost is balanced by the fact that you have less cost to maintain security and less security than in the system. Let me see then if this mechanism, again in Bitcoin, is working or not, okay? So given that, assuming the security is there, and to some extent there has been no double spending attack so far, is efficient for the purpose, which is verifying and validating transaction. And this is a study done already 2 years ago, which in blockchain time is an eternity. So I mean, don't take it as a picture of what's happening now, but I mean, this is an interesting study. We monitored the transaction for about 1 week during May 2016. All transactions, so we generate a node pretending to be a miners, and then, I mean, we took all transactions in the system, and then we look for the 6 following months when each of those transactions appeared during that period, or broadcasted during that period, was getting into the blockchain. And we had a surprise. So we found out that although a large number of transactions do get in the first and second blocks generated after the transaction is broadcasted, the number after 1 hour is only 58%. So 42% of the transactions are not registered in the blockchain after 1 hour. So the time actually is not at all 10 minutes, it's much longer. And actually what was even more surprising, we check again the result, was that actually only 80% are in the blockchain after 30 days, after 1 month. So after 1 month, still 20% of the transaction is missed. Well, this was a huge surprise. However, then we look which transaction there were. And indeed, I mean, as the common sense tells us, they were very, very small transactions. This is this fraction of, of fragmented coins that make the dust into the system. But still 0.1% was not registered in the blockchain after 1 month. And why? I mean, again, it was a surprise. Then I went to talk with some miners, etc. And essentially the answer was, of course. I mean, why should we care? We don't make money out of looking for transactions that were not written in the blockchain and putting there. If people pay us fees, then we might do it with some more diligence, but even that is not our main source of revenue. So, I mean, we are not really too much worried about that. And that, again, is an emerging properties as consequence of a system of incentives. And just to give the full picture, if we look at the transaction values, it's kind of obvious. You see the speed is faster when transactions are very high. I mean, if you make a transaction a few millions, I mean, you do make sure that is registered in the blockchain after an hour or so. Otherwise, I mean, you start actively trying to do it or redo the transaction or whatever you want, you can do. And however, there are some very large transactions still that waits a long time, 600 blocks before getting into the system. And actually, the surprise is that also transaction fee make the insertion into blockchain faster, but not that fast. Again, there is a large queue of transactions that stay there for a very long time, even if people have paid fees. Again, remember, a smaller value transaction, but still are there. So again, and this is not to some extent, should not be a big surprise. I mean, miners are not remunerated to do this job, and that is an emerging property. They don't do this job, or they don't do this job efficiently enough. So let's go a little bit higher level, and let's try to understand as designers, as industry entrepreneurs that want to design new blockchain system or adapt existing blockchain system, which are the main element? Well, from my point of view, there are two fundamental elements. One is the actual design, and the other one is the emerging properties. And the actual design, as I give for the example for the Bitcoin, are constraints and are inputs. And I will specify them in the next few slides. And the emerging properties instead are something much more complicated, much more complex. They are evolutive. They are mechanisms that change. They are dynamical, and they are very hard to predict from the constituents. So constraints are what you want in the system or what you need from the system. And these are limits. And these limits, for instance, the availability of incentive mechanisms. Why I'm focusing on incentives? Well, because the topic of my talk, but also because this is essentially the only quantity that we have to steer the system in one direction or in the other. So, for instance, if we have a purely anonymous blockchain, we can only provide the economic incentives because, I mean, we don't know who the user has, so we cannot prize user because they behave well, just because they will come with a different identity every time they use the system. And if we want to use trust-based incentives, then we should introduce limitation to the anonymity. And even more if we want to do social kind of incentives. And again, if we want to, in an anonymous system, we should consume external resources just as proxy for reputation. And resources or put large amount of money on stake. And centralized authority can bootstrap the reputation system. However, this is to the price of anonymity. But what is very, very important is that any property that we are trying to establish in the system is either an emerging, a spontaneously and endogenously emerging property from the system, or that property will not be stable and will eventually disappear. Even if you seed it from the beginning, it will go away with the dynamics. And this is seen in economic system all the time. And what's the main emerging property of this system? Well, the main emerging property of this system is cooperation. Why cooperation? Because in distributed system, participants must contribute to the maintenance of the system. This is the absolute necessity in distributed system. And this cooperation can be, I'm rephrasing essentially what I said before, it can be obtained in two ways. One with enforcement or with remuneration, or both eventually. And essentially there are no other ways. And enforcement requires to know participant identity. I mean, you don't have to know who actually they are as individual, but you have to uniquely identify participant. And that also requires strong governance body. Instead, remuneration are economic incentives. They can be given to anonymous system. They can be given in completely distributed system. However, as I give the example for Lucerne, that's very hard to implement. And in a very simple terms, I mean, if you give small incentives, they will not be enough to persuade people to participate, to do things. And if you give instead too large, then will definitely generate specialization and concentration. And the fine line between the two is very, very hard to find. And also, typically, participants don't like when people change the rules during the game. And therefore, there are not that many instruments to steer the system once it's been designed. So to give an overview, it's so what are the input and the constraint? Input and constraint I mentioned already is certainly anonymity, is social responsibility, is regulation. Regulation certainly is a constraint, is the reference community, the business model, the reference market, the governance model, the scalability, the speed at which you want to grow, etc., etc. The technology protocols are the validation methodology first, but not, and the cryptography certainly. And the security in general, the speed is obviously one of the technological issues. Scalability, again, can go on this side as well. And are also the incentives. And incentives are economic incentive, or institutional incentive, or social incentive, or perhaps others. And which are the emerging properties? Well, the emerging properties, I certainly already mentioned specialization, but there is not only specialization, there is certainly centralization and versus distribution. There is reputation. Reputation is something that is generated endogenously into the system. There is trust, again, that is generated endogenously into the system. There is failure. There is failure and success. I mean, failure and success are emerging properties of the system. And there is the forking risk, which is related to failure and success. And these are all in the design, but cannot be determined a priori by the design, are dynamical properties that come out when people start using it. And it's very, very hard, not impossible, but very, very hard to predict one from the other. And let me give you an example. So if we design a system with the constraint of anonymity, so full anonymity, we have a strong constraint on the validation methodology. Essentially, we can use only proof of work. And so we can use only economic incentives. And this is kind of likely to end up in specialization. This is certainly what happened to Bitcoin, but this is what also happened to many other coins and systems that has been proposed. And if we release complete anonymity, we do identify users and validators. Then we have other validation mechanisms. And certainly the institutional incentive and institutional punishment or status can run the system smoothly. This, however, unavoidably brings the system toward centralization instead of distribution. You need a strong governance, a strong authority that even if the system is distributed, it will be an emerging properties of the system. And if we look at, if we try to map, a few of the existing protocols, in particular Bitcoin, Ripple, and Ethereum, we see all these kind of elements. I already mentioned for Bitcoin. Bitcoin is anonymous in terms of users, is anonymous also in terms of proof of work. The incentives are economic. There are no social incentives. It ends up with high and increasing specialization, high consumption of external resources, but it is a fairly distributed system. Ripple, which is to some extent an opposite example, it is anonymous for users, or can be anonymous for users, already, however, is not anonymous for the validators. These allowed to give rewards to validators in a different way, in terms of reputation, a social kind, statutory kind of a reputation, and it can give also reward to user through other mechanisms. And this seems to work to give a fixed level of specialization and low consumption of resources. However, it relies on trustable validators, which means generate concentration, it generates centralization. And Ethereum again is anonymous or pseudo-anonymous in users and also in validators, and of course as in plus as the smart contract. In terms of rewards, in terms of incentive, it uses economic incentive, not a social incentive, and it has some trick in the design to use less computational power, but my argument on the cost of proof of works, it's still valid, so you cannot escape the cost. In fact, is moving toward the proof of stake protocol. But again, these end up unavoidably in high specialization, in high consumption of eternal resources, except for the proof of stake choice, and in a distributed system, and in the case of Ethereum, in high risk of forking. Well, this was inside of design. It might not necessarily be something that you don't like, but this is certainly something that is an emerging property. And so, I have a couple of minutes. Let me conclude with the take-home messages. So we have blockchain system follows by design, they have some input constraint and some technological choices. But the actual properties and functionality of the system are emerging properties. They come from the design, but they are not specified in the design and will be discovered when the system works. And the main instrument to make these, or to steer these emerging properties, are incentives. And this is a very important part of the design and the only instrument, essentially, that we can use after the technological choices are taken. And thank you.